I'm going to show you how to make the other cylinder with the folded ends for hemming. So this cylinder, I start with a rectangle. It's 11 inches by 9 inches. And I'm going to take the long side, the 11 inches, and just fold it in half. So I want to line up the edges, and I'm going to sew that 1/4 inch. For this one, I'm going to do a seam allowance, or a French seam. So the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I sew the seam. So for this one, instead of putting right sides together, I actually put wrong sides together. This is just muslin that I'm sewing with, so it doesn't actually have a difference in sides. So after I sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch. I want to get it really close to the seam because I'm going to encase the seam and sew this raw edge into the seam. And French seams are a great method if you're using a really sheer fabric like an organza or chiffon. So you can see here I have this seam and there are these raw edges here, and I trimmed it down to about 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm gonna flatten this out and iron it really good to one side. And as I'm ironing, so I put the iron down, I want to pull the seam open as I iron and push it to one side. If I don't do that, sometimes the fabric gets folded and you can see some of that will be underneath as I iron. I want to make sure to open it up as I'm ironing it down. Now I'm going to iron this seam down, and I'm going to be real careful not to iron a crease in the edge of this fabric. Sometimes it's not preventable because of how narrow the tube is. But you can see I'm pulling here and I've ironed that seam open. So on the inside you can see I've pulled it as far as I can. Now I'm going to right side out this, or wrong side out it really, because this is going to end up being the inside. So I find that seam where I just ironed it, and I really want to push the very edge of the machine, or the seam, to the right. So you can see right here, see the edge of the seam is right there. So I'm going to go along, and now I'm going to iron this seam really flat. Only this seam right here where it's sewn, not this edge here. I want to make sure to avoid that. So now I'm going to go and sew again 1/4 inch, and you can see where I trimmed that down 1/8 of an inch. That's going to be encased inside of a seam. That's called a French seam. So I have the seam on the right side that's ironed down, and now I'm going to sew 1/4 inch along that seam. So there's 1/8 of an inch inside of here, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch so that encases that seam. You really want to make sure to trim that seam down to make sure that goes inside. If it's too long, it's going to stick outside of the seam, of the French seam. So now you can see I have a seam and the raw edges are encased inside. I'm going to go ahead and iron this down, and then I will right side out it. This is really great for clothing so you don't have a raw edge, especially if you don't have a serger or a cover stitch or overlock machine. It's also really good for sheer fabrics where you don't want the seam to show, you want it to be more elegant. So the seam is sewn on the inside, the raw edge is on the inside now, so I have my French seam complete. Now I'm just gonna iron it, and I, again, will pull the side of the fabric as I'm ironing to make sure I get a nice crisp edge of that seam. Now I'm gonna take the fabric and I right side out it. So you can see I have a seam there, and the inside has this encased French seam. Now for hemming the ends, instead of adding extra fabric, I'm just gonna fold up this edge 1/4 inch. And I'm gonna iron it all the way around as I do that. And I'm eyeballing my 1/4 inch, but it's good to get a ruler to measure that. So now when I'm ironing this, I wanna make sure that my seam is going to the right side on this side. And it's really important on the other side, you just have to decide which side your seam lays to. On the other side, I'm gonna make sure it's laying flat all the way down. You can imagine if one side has the seam going one direction and the other direction on the other seam, you're gonna have a seam that twists in the middle. And if that's on a shirt or a pair of pants, it would be really uncomfortable. You want the seams to lay as flat as possible. So now I've ironed that. For sampling, it's not quite as important. So you can see there, it's 1/4 inch. But if you're sewing a garment, you really want to make sure you know exactly how much you're sewing. So now that I did 1/4 inch, I'm gonna fold it again. Exactly along that seam, another 1/4 inch. And this will be sewn down. So this is another way of hemming, just a double fold. This is a really simple way to hem something. If you want a bigger hem, you would just fold it more, which can be great for a pair of pants or a shirt if you think you're gonna have to let it out later and make it longer. So here we go, we've gone all the way around. Then I'm gonna iron the other side. So that's ironed all the way, so that'll stay in place when I'm sewing it. And now this side, so now you can see the seam, if you look down it, is laying to the left side when I flip it over. I wanna make sure it stays there. If I were to flip it here to hem it, you can see how inside that seam is twisted. So we wanna make sure that's nice and flat. I'm gonna start with 1/4 inch here, and then I'm gonna do 1/2 inch for the second fold. Just to show you the difference in the finishing. So I'm using a ruler this time. So I've ironed that all the way around. And now instead of folding this 1/4 inch like that, I want to fold it 1/2 inch. So I'm using my ruler and I'm lining it up to 1/2 inch. And And I like to start where the seam is because it's bulkier and a little bit harder to line up. So I like to get that out of the way and make sure that's the beginning. Okay, so now that I have both of the ends folded and ironed, I'm going to go back and sew this to finish my cylinder. So to hem this, I have the outside of my cylinder, so the right side facing up, and I've put my presser foot and I have a 1/2 inch mark right here. I'm going just about a 1/16 of an inch shy of that because I want to make sure, actually I can go right at 1/2 inch. I want to make sure that my thread goes all the way through both layers of my cylinder. So as I'm sewing, I want to straighten out part of this fabric as I sew and move it around. So I'm just going to sew several stitches and keep moving this around, all while being careful to keep my fingers far enough away from the needle so I don't sew into my fingers. And I also am making sure back here I don't have fabric that's underneath this that I'm sewing, so I'm not sewing multiple things together. I'm just hemming the fabric. Something like this, a cylinder that's fairly small, it's easy to get fabric caught underneath, which then gives you all sorts of other problems. You can see right here I'm holding the back flat because it's starting to curve up. I'm not pulling it, I was just trying to adjust it to where it needed to go. Okay, so one seam is finished. I'm going to go ahead and iron it once I'm done with the other side. So you can see it's nice and hemmed all the way around. Now the other side, I want to make sure it's folded under again where I ironed it. And this one's a 1/4 inch, so I'm going to make sure to line it up to the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm double checking here to make sure all of that fabric is getting underneath the presser foot and I'm not missing it with the needle. And again, I'm holding the fabric nice and flat here and giving myself a lot of space to be able to sew it. And now I've finished that cylinder and I'm going to iron it and I'll show you the finished look. But you can see here that seam is nice and secure inside